Please make her incredibly welcome. It's Rachel Andrew.
Okay, so yes, I made it. Plane landed at Heathrow at 10 o'clock. I was very, very glad when it sort of left on time. Usually all my flights seem to be very delayed, so it was a good one to be on time and made it down here. I was actually at the CSS Working Group meeting over in Toronto. That's where I've come from. So I've been in 3 days of meetings designing new CSS and fixing what appear to be very, very tiny problems which take a very, very long time to discuss over those 3 days. And so yes, I've been kind of doing things on the web since about 1996. It's becoming increasingly difficult to tell people what it is that I actually do. But it's sort of some kind of collection of those things. I'm editor-in-chief of Smashing magazine. If you ever fancy writing for Smashing, I am always interested, particularly new writers, people who haven't written before. We love to help people with that. And I'm a member of the CSS Working Group, to say I'm actually an official representative of Frontiers, who are a Dutch collective of web developers. So I'm essentially on the CSS Working Group and on the W3C as a representative of web developers, as opposed to a representative of a browser vendor, which is what a lot of the people on the group are. So what I'm going to talk about today really is really about grid layout and kind of where we are at this point. Because we're actually 2 years on from grid layout landing in our browsers. If you remember when CSS Grid shipped, it shipped into really all of our browsers pretty much at the same time, which is quite an unusual thing to happen. Normally we expect that a bit of CSS will go into one browser and then sort of like 2 years later somebody else will implement it. Grid was such a fundamentally important thing that it was prioritized by everyone as this important thing and came out in browsers pretty much at the same time. And so we're 2 years on from that point, and I'm still kind of getting this kind of question from people. 2 years on, people are still debating whether they should even use grid layout, or is Flexbox enough? Should we have maybe stopped there? Now the thing is, nobody asks me this question. No one is asking me whether they should use color or fonts in their web design, yet they are constantly asking me whether they should be using Flexbox or Grid, as if we're talking about choosing between Bootstrap and Foundation. And I think it really is time to stop thinking about these as two different layout methods, because they're not. They're just two values of the display property. They're all CSS. And so really you should be using the layout method that suits the pattern that you're trying to create. The fact that Flexbox and Grid are two different CSS specifications is just working group process. We've broken CSS down into different specifications because otherwise the full entirety of CSS would be like those Encyclopedia Britannicas that people used to have on the walls. It would just go on, and we'd never be able to get anything finished. So we have these individual specs. But the fact that we don't just, for instance, have one display spec, which has all of the different things you can do with display, is really just working group process. Flexbox and Grid, they're just CSS. They're tools that you've got to use. And really at this point, there's not a huge amount of difference in terms of browser support. And yes, older versions of IE do have Flexbox support, but it's pretty fragile and buggy if you've tried to use it in anger. So it's going to require some specific attention anyway. So you might as well just use, if you're building a brand new site now, use the modern CSS that works for the patterns that you're trying to create, and then create fallbacks that work for the old IEs. Rather than hobbling your design and your creativity and everything that you can do to the web browsers of the past. So the pattern that you need to build will generally tell you what you need to use. And I like to talk about Flexbox. So say you've got a bunch of stuff. It's all different sizes. And all you want to do is kind of display that in the most readable way. Display that in a sensible way so that you don't have a giant thing squashed into a tiny box and lots of space around a small thing. That's what you want. Now that is a really good job for Flexbox. That's what it's for. It's what it was designed for. It's not a grid. Flexbox is really good at this sort of squishy sizing, where you just want things to take the amount of space that they need. But if you've got a set structure in mind, if you've got certain column sizes and row sizes and you want them all to kind of line up with each other, and you want to put the things into those cells, well, that's a grid. You're lining things up in rows and columns at the same time. You know, that's grid. Now, you can do that with Flexbox by adding widths to everything. But that's not really the point. You know, if you're trying to make Flexbox behave like grid layout, then you probably should have just used grid in the first place. And just because you're putting things into a grid, it doesn't mean that the size of the item can't affect the track sizing, but it's going to change all the way along the track. If you put a bigger thing into a column and you're using some kind of content-aware sizing, that whole track is going to get bigger. And really, when you don't want to be using Flexbox, typically, if you are adding widths to all of your flex items individually, if you're going around and sort of controlling their size specifically, that's generally a good sort of feeling there that, hey, I probably should be using grid because I'm trying to kind of control the whole thing. I'm trying to line things up in 2 dimensions. So here's a common pattern. So we've got a set of cards. I've laid them out using Flexbox. So we've got sort of 3 items there, and they all lay out nicely using Flexbox. And then we get some more content. We add some more cards. And we get this kind of display because we've got an odd number of cards here. They don't neatly make 3 cards at the top and 3 cards underneath. And because all the cards can grow and shrink so that they can sort of take up as much space as there, the cards on the bottom, because there's only 2 of them, they've both grown an equal amount and they've shared the space, which is why they're kind of splitting the space between them. Now, if you're thinking, oh, I can only use Flexbox because I'm using Flexbox, I must use Flexbox, then you're going to be saying, well, how do I put widths on those cards to make them line up with the ones above? But actually, really what you should be thinking is, am I using the right layout method? And really what you want, if you want to have cards 4 and 5 line up under 1 and 2, you want to be using grid layout. And really a couple of lines and a flex layout becomes a grid layout, and you've got what you wanted. And there's a bit of a difference between what we do here. As you see with Flexbox, we have to do things on the child items. I'm doing things on the list items themselves to sort of set sizing and so on. With grid, we do everything on the parents, then we kind of put the child items into the gaps that you've created. But it's pretty easy to switch about. If you realize that you're heading off down the wrong line and Flexbox isn't the thing you should be using, or grid isn't the thing you should be using, you should be able to switch between those layout methods fairly easily. And so here's my grid version, and you can see that the cards then line up in their rows and their columns. And that's really all we mean when we describe grid as 2-dimensional. You can lay things out in rows and in columns at the same time. And 2-dimensional alignment means much more than just this basic example of flex items sharing out all the space and grid items falling into the cells that we've created. 2-dimensional alignment means that the grid works in exactly the same way in both dimensions. And we don't always see that immediately because, well, there's a sort of easy reason for that. On the web, block elements expand in the inline dimension to be the extent of the available space in the container. So they'll just get as wide as they can. We kind of know that. So they're extending in the inline direction as big as they can get. But they don't expand in the block dimension. Things don't become as tall as your viewport by default, for example. So you have to give things a length in the block dimension if you want to have spare available space there. And if you do give it a length, then your track sizing and alignment and everything else in grid works in exactly the same way as it does in the inline dimension. So if you want to play with height or the block dimension, if you want to align things, if you want to leave white space, when you're using grid layout, you can do that. And I think that's something we don't play with enough in web design. And the reason we don't is because when we were tied to using floated layouts, if you left a gap, it was quite likely that something would kind of float up and sit in it. It was very difficult to kind of keep that space. With grid layout, you can start to play with white space and see, what sort of things you can do there. So there's all sorts of things that you can play around with. And that's a reason to use grid. You might have a layout that could be either way. But if you want to play around with things in both dimensions, then grid would let you do that. And then there's another reason you might want to use grid. And that's to help with these layouts where we're restricting things in the block dimension. So a pattern we might see is neat fixed height cells, fixed height rows of content. We sometimes see this. People use it for navigation sometimes. You'll have lovely little neat boxes that are going to be a certain height. And that's always been a little bit difficult to do on the web, because every time you fix the height of something, you risk your content overflowing. You kind of end up, you've got now too much content and it's coming out of the box. And we sort of see this all the time. We've seen this forever on the web. I've got a CMS product. We still get people coming into our forum saying, how can I stop too much content getting into the CMS because it's breaking my layout? And so, we're actually letting our design, our desire to have this kind of control affect the content that we're using. And that's not great. So one of my favorite uses of the min-max function for track sizing is to create this effect of having a layout which is constrained in the block dimension, having a layout which is height constrained, but if too much content gets in, those tracks can grow. So the min-max function, we say, min-max 100 pixel, I want my track to be 100 pixels tall. Even if it's got no content in it, it should be 100 pixels tall. But if more content gets in, the maximum is auto. And auto for grid tracks means pretty much big enough to take the content. So that track will keep on getting taller if it needs to. So we can build these kind of resilient layouts, these resilient components that look pixel perfect, that look like they're all lined up beautifully as we wanted. But if more content gets in, if that headline really, really does need to be 40 words long, then it's going to work. It's still all not going to break. You're not going to get overlapping content. You're not going to get stuff cut off. So really all this is to say you've just got a lot more choice now when you're designing layouts, when you're designing your patterns. Please take advantage of them. They have been a very, very long time coming. And there's very rarely a kind of right or a wrong way to do things. But if you try and force one layout method to be another, you're just making your life harder. And if your life is becoming really, really hard doing one of these things, it may be that we've designed something else that would do it better. And I keep being asked, this was a quote actually from a workshop, I keep being asked, people will say, is this usage of grid okay? Or am I using flex correctly? And this is pretty much my answer. Does it work? In most cases, if it's working for you and your team, then it's fine. CSS specifications very rarely tell you how you should write CSS. It's not the sort of remit of the CSS Working Group to tell web designers and developers how they should write CSS. About the only time that we put things into the specifications that say don't do this are when it is to do with accessibility. So we will advise you not to do certain things that could cause an accessibility problem. But otherwise, is it working? Is it working for you, your team, the browsers you need to support? That's really what you should be looking at. And in terms of accessibility, just while we're sort of thinking about things that we might tell you, not to do, the one thing that you need to take care of with both Flexbox and Grid, it's probably more of a problem with Grid, is this content reordering problem. It's very easy with both Flexbox and Grid to jumble up the logical order of your content, which is what it is in the source, so how you've got your content in the source, ordered in your HTML, and then the visual representation of that, which is what you've done with Grid or Flexbox. Now, with Grid and Flexbox, it's pretty easy with the order property, with line-based positioning or grid template areas, to actually kind of jumble up the logical order, which is going to affect the way that it's, how if someone is having it read out to them, but they can see the screen, which there's lots of people who are using some kind of screen reader but can actually see the screen. It's going to be a very disconnected experience if it's reading out the source, yet where they actually are on the screen is different, or if they're tabbing around the document. So that's one place where the CSS Working Group do say, hey, don't do this. Don't jumble up this experience. A very quick way to test this is this tool here, which is what I've got up on the screen. This is Accessibility Insights, which Microsoft have released. It has this tab stop checker, which allows you to see what the natural order is of your content. So if you're using Grid or Flexbox and you might have moved the order around a bit, that's a very simple check. Is that still logical? We're not having a situation where the first item's up here and then you're like right down the bottom of the page somewhere for the next thing and then back up. Trying to keep the source and the visual display sort of in sync is really important. So that's something that we might tell you that you should watch out for, and that's in the CSS specifications. But in general, we're not prescriptive about this stuff. We're just busy designing CSS. We would like you then to use it and then let us know what else we need to be doing. And so on that note, what can't we do yet? So we've got all these neat things that we can do. And as people are starting to use Grid Layout and Flexbox to an extent, people are really starting to use these tools, you start to run into new problems. You start to find new things that you can't do. You're like, well, it solved all of these problems. This whole class of problems have gone away, but hey, I still can't do this. Or now, because I can do these things, I want to be able to do this. So I'm always interested in what people run into. I really enjoy working on CSS because I see myself mostly in all the things that I do as really a problem solver. CSS has loads of problems that we can solve. So that makes me really happy. And I enjoy looking at those. So, what's coming up? What might we still want to solve? So if we go back to these airplane cards, and I've got, two cards there displayed next to each other, and they've got different amounts of text in their captions. So the captions there don't line up. This one has got quite a tall caption, and the Airbus A380, that's just got a little name, so that's got a small caption there, and they don't line up. Now, that might be fine, but I think a lot of the times when you've got that kind of layout, you'd like the captions to line up with each other too. You'd like the whole thing to look like a grid. So my cards are a figure inside the LI. Now the LI is a direct child of the grid, so it participates in grid layout, and that's why our cards really easily lay out on that nice grid. Now the figure nested down inside the markup, that's an independent grid. It's got 2 columns and 2 rows. I'm using min-max to stop the caption sort of collapsing if it had no content, and giving it a max of auto, so it's expanding to take the content. But the crucial thing is, card A knows nothing about the sizing of the internals of card B. The things that are direct children of the grid, they understand the sizing and they can all be the same height, but things that are nested down inside the structure don't know about other things nested down inside the structure. So why can't we just lay out things deep in our markup on the overall grid? So we need to understand that problem. CSS has this concept of normal flow, or block and inline layout. Now, you might not have heard it referred to in those terms, but it's pretty much the first thing that you learn about CSS. We have things that are block, we have things that are inline, you can switch between the two. And by default, if you write some HTML and load stuff in the web browser with its default style sheet loads that up, and it's readable because it displays in this normal flow. And the thing to think about is that CSS is always trying to go back to normal flow. So the values of display don't inherit. So if you say display grid on a parent, the direct children become grid items, but their children go back to normal flow because that's what CSS does. If it didn't, you'd be constantly resetting things all the way down, and that would be a real nuisance. So there's a simple flex example. We've got a normal flow heading, we've got a paragraph, I've got a box set to display flex, so the image and the content are flex items. Inside the flex item, I've then got another heading and some content. That's gone back to normal flow. It's not also become flex items, because that would just be weird. So that's why my captions don't participate in the grid layout. So they can't be placed on the tracks defined from the parent grid, because they don't know anything about it. They're just in normal flow, and then I can create a grid, but then I'm essentially just starting over again with a new independent grid. So those things aren't, inheriting anything. So that's cool. That's how CSS works, and generally it's fine. But sometimes we would like things to be able to kind of participate in the grid on the parent. We'd like to be able to opt into that sometimes. Now, the only way to do that at the moment would be to start basically flattening out the markup, perhaps taking the cards out of the list to maintain autoplace, but actually have to break the source order. So you'd end up with like 2 images and then 2 captions. Now, that is obviously terrible, and you should never do that because that is just making a terrible mess. So we don't want to do that. It's the sort of thing we used to do with like nested table layouts in the past. Anybody else ever built a website with tables? You see, you're my people. There's lots of you. This is marvelous. We'll have some sort of therapy session later. That's great. But yeah, that's kind of what we did. We don't want to go back to that sort of thing. That's not the world that we're designing now. You'll be glad to know. So how do we get this to work? Now, there's another sort of value of display, this display contents. Now, this won't work in the scenario we're looking at. If you've heard of display contents, the fact that we need to rearrange our items to make auto placement work is why display contents won't work either. But there is sometimes a bit of confusion between display contents and the subgrid property value that I'm going to talk about. So let's have a look at what display contents actually does and why it doesn't help us here. Display content is potentially really useful. It's useful when you have elements that you want to participate in grid or flex layout, but they've got some markup around them, which means that they're not a direct, those items aren't a direct child of the grid. So they need to have some markup to make them semantically whatever it is they are, but you don't want to display the box of that markup. A good example is what we've got here, which is a list. So I've got a layout here, I've got some items which are direct children. I've then got a list which is a UL which is a direct child. It's got some list items inside. They're obviously list items, they're not on the grid. And then we've got another item. So if you can see the markup, it looks a bit like that. So the direct children have got that sort of lighter background color on them, and then the list items have the pink background color. And there's the CSS. So we can see how that's working. Now, all we need to do if we want to use display contents, what we're going to do with display contents is pretty much like what you do when you say display none. So if you say display none, we remove the box that you say display none on and all of the children. It's as if it was never there. If you say display contents, we just remove that box, but we leave the children, which will give you a layout that looks like this. So we've removed the box of the UL, but we've left the list items there, and they are now participating in grid layout and laying themselves out. They're still children of the UL for all of the reasons, which is why they've still got a background color of pink, because they're still a direct child of a UL in all other reasons other than the fact that that box has gone from the layout. Now, display contents will be really, really useful. It's actually really well supported in browsers, but unfortunately it has a massive bug, which is quite annoying. Essentially, the display property should only affect visual things, other than display none. Display none is also parsed by things like screen readers. So if you say display none on an item, a screen reader also won't read it out. It will honor that, so you can then bring it back in a sensible way. But everything else in display should be pretty much ignored by things that aren't visual, which is why your source order goes with the document source and not whatever you've done with display grid. When browsers implemented display contents, they also removed the information from the accessibility tree and made those things unfocusable. Now, it turns out that I think probably what they did is they looked at display none, so this is a bit like display none, and just removed the box. And that has had bad effects for accessibility. They are fixing it. Firefox have pretty much fixed it. I think there's a few things that are a bit of an issue. Chrome are in the process of fixing it. So at the moment, display contents, while it does work in browsers, you need to be very, very careful if you're using it, because you can essentially render things inaccessible, essentially by making a list not a list anymore as far as a screen reader or something is concerned. So you need to be fairly careful. It's a useful thing, but it's not really going to help in the situation we've got anyway. I think it's useful for other use cases, but you just need to be careful with this sort of accessibility problem that we've currently got. And it's kind of a problem with anything new in CSS. You know, it may well raise new problems that we have to take care of. So display contents, even if it didn't have this problem, isn't actually going to help us with the situation we've got with our cards. We need something else. What we really want is our gridded item, our little box, the captions to be in the same row as each other, even though they're nested down inside the markup. And that's basically what this subgrid feature is going to let us do. So you can already obviously make a grid item a grid. So you can say display grid on any grid item, and you can give it columns and you can give it rows, and it becomes its own independent grid. You can nest grids as far down as you want. You can make a grid item a grid. You can make a grid item a flex container. It doesn't matter. You can keep on changing the value of display however you need to be. But those things are going to be independent. They're independent grids. They don't have any relationship to the rows and columns on the parent. So if we turn on the Firefox Grid Inspector, we can have a look at that. So you can see there the outer grid on the parent, and that's the one with the white border. And we can select our inner grid, and that's got fixed height rows, and so that grid doesn't quite fill the container there. And if we select both of the grids in the grid inspector, you can see how there's no relationship between those lines. They don't sort of line up with each other. They're just completely separate in there. We've basically started all over again with a brand new grid. So with subgrid, we can selectively opt grids on grid items into our grid layout. And we can do that columns or rows or both. So if we wanted our columns to use the tracks on the parent grid, then we would say grid template columns, subgrid. So don't define any column tracks of its own. Define a subgrid, and then it's going to use the tracks that it's got, that area has from the parent. And we could do that for rows. So in this case, I've defined my own columns. I've decided I want the column tracks to be whatever, and then I'm using subgrid on rows. And we can also just create the subgrid in both dimensions, so we can then tie the sub-item completely to the dimensions of the parent grid. And that's pretty much the main feature. You know, we can, instead of defining your columns or your rows, you can say subgrid, and then you use the columns or the rows from the parent. As with anything in CSS, there are, you know, some finer details that you might need to think about. One of those is that line numbers start from one inside the subgrid. The subgrid acts pretty much exactly the same as a nested grid would, except that it's getting its track sizing from the parent. You don't have to work out which line your subgrid is sat on and count from that. They start over from one inside the subgrid, just kind of as you'd expect, really. So in this example, we've got, you know, subgrid line 1 is on line 2 of the parent grid. And so when placing items inside the subgrid, you use the subgrid's line numbers, not the parent's. Now, if you did want to use something of the parent to position the item inside the subgrid, that's a reasonable use case. You can name your lines on the parent, and they will get passed through into the subgrid. So that would be the way to do that. So, for example, if I named lines on my parent grid, col start and col end, I could then position something inside the subgrid with those names. So that would allow me to line something up, deep nested inside the layout, with a line on the parent, because I've named the lines. So when you name your lines, you do that inside square brackets. You're naming the lines, not the tracks. So it's the line before and after the tracks. And then they get passed through, and you can use those inside the subgrid. Basically, lines and grid can have masses of names. There's all sorts of ways to end up with named lines. It doesn't matter, you can have as many as you like. Just pick whichever one you want to be using when you're positioning your item. If you want to name lines specifically scoped to the subgrid, you can do that. You can add named lines to the subgrid. They are added after the subgrid keyword. So for instance, if we wanted to name all of our lines in our subgrid, so sub A, B, C, D, and E, and then position another item on those, we basically name a sort of a string of lines with square brackets after the subgrid keyword, because we haven't actually got any track sizing to put in between them, as we would when we name the lines on the parent. So you just name them all as a list, and then you can use those to position items if you want to do that. I think fairly obviously, and probably what you'd expect, the subgrid inherits the gaps from the parent. So if you've used gap, grid gap, row gap on the parent, they'll just get passed through, and you can then use those. So everything will just line up. But sometimes when you've got an item that's a subgridded item, you don't want it to have gaps. You would like to be able to change the gaps. You might want to have bigger gaps, but everything still line up with the parent, and you can do that. You can change them. If you use the gap properties in the subgrid, it will override whatever the parent is using. So, for instance, here I've set my row gap to 0, and it's basically the effect as if you've added a negative margin. So the sort of item will kind of eat into the gap. And so the lines from the parent sort of run essentially down the middle of the gap. So if you want to set your gap to 0, then the content is just going to sort of eat into that gap. Sort of whichever way you've set that to 0, or if you've added a gap, you've made the gap larger, or added a gap where there was no gap, then it's as if you've added a margin to the item. And then, of course, sizing of the items in the subgrid. If you've used some kind of content-based sizing, so auto, min content, max content, that's going to change the size of the parent tracks. And so if we return to our airplane cards example, that's how we get the captions to line up across the grid. We make it a subgrid and nest that down inside to the subgridded figures, and make the card span 2 rows of the subgrid. The parent grid has a gap if you don't want in the card, so we set that to 0. And the card captions are now basically in the same row of the grid, which is pretty neat, and I think will work in a very intuitive way once you start doing it, because it really is just the same as nesting a grid, except that you're getting your track information from the parent rather than having it specified directly on the child. Now, as I've started playing around with this, I think that's kind of the obvious use case. The obvious use cases of subgrid are things like, I've got a 12-column grid, and I want everything, including things nested down, to line up with that. Or things like that card layout. They're the obvious use cases of subgrid. There's a few other things that I'm starting to play around with it. I'm realizing that we can solve some things where people have said, oh, I can't do this in grid layout. Can you give me a way to do it? And I think subgrid might be the solution for some of these things. This is one of them. Kind of accidentally, I sort of realized this. We've got the ability to target line -1 of the grid, which is the end line of the grid. But it's only the end line of the explicit grid, so the grid that you specify with grid template rows and grid template columns. So I've got here 5 explicit grid rows, which the small items then sort of autofill into. Because we've got explicit rows, I can use -1 to stretch that pink item right to the end. So line -1 is the end of the explicit grid. But actually what happens more often is you don't know how many of the cards you're going to be putting into the cells. You want to have as many grid rows created as you need to fill up with cards. In that case, you're making use of the implicit grid, and you get that. Because you can't target line -1 and that be the end of of implicit tracks. There's no way to do that. And it's something that comes up as a request quite often. So here I've got no defined explicit rows. And so line -1 essentially just leaves the pink box up in the corner because we don't have 5 rows of the explicit grid for it to go to. So this is a problem. We can't target the end line of the implicit grid. But we can do this by using subgrid. So what you need to do is place the items into a container which uses a subgrid for columns. So what this lets us do is have all the columns be sort of equal width there, because we're using 1FR. We wanted those columns all to be a nice equal width. So the pink column is going to be the same width as all the other columns. If we get smaller or bigger, that's still going to work. But all of the items are essentially in one row. Now that row can have implicit tracks. We're not using a subgrid on those items, so we can have as many as we like. But because essentially they're all in one row, then the pink item can span down to the bottom of it. It doesn't matter because we've got a subgridded item there. So that is quite a useful little thing that we can be doing. Now, I think as we start to play with subgrid, I think there is a bunch of patterns like this that maybe, introducing just an extra wrapper, as we did in this case, allows us to solve all sorts of things that have been a little bit tricky to do with grid layout as it stands. So I think that's going to be quite fun as we start to play with it and find some of those things, solve some of those problems. But yeah, now the bad news. This is all very cool, however. Slightly better news. All of my examples there were screenshots, and they were screenshots from Firefox Nightly. So if you download Firefox Nightly, you can play with all my examples, which are all online. You can get those, you can play with the examples in Firefox Nightly and get all that stuff working. Firefox have implemented subgrid, so there's one of my examples with the Firefox Grid Inspector open so that we can play around with them. And it is really, really important that you do play around with this stuff and that you do try things out as they're starting to get into the platform. And this is why. We are losing rendering engines. Edge has gone to Chromium, and I think some people think, oh great, we've got one less browser to test. But the problem with fewer rendering engines is we have fewer places where experiments can happen. We only got Grid in the first place because the Microsoft team implemented Grid, an early version, a sort of prototype version of the spec in IE 10. I probably wouldn't be standing here today talking about it had it not been for that Internet Explorer 10 implementation, because it gave me something to play with and to start to say, well, hang on, this doesn't quite work in such a good way. Maybe we could be doing this. It allowed something to be tested. It allowed me to show it to people and get people excited about the possibilities of something like Grid. That was really, really important, the interest of web developers helping to move Grid forward and actually get it into browsers. That was very important. And so, I'm worried that with fewer rendering engines, we've got fewer places where these experiments can happen, where new ground can be broken, where we can start to get new stuff. And that is why it's really important that we as the web development community use our influence on the browsers that are left. And we do have influence. So how do we kind of tell browsers what it is that we actually want? Well, you can literally just go and tell them. Browsers have bug trackers where you can raise issues, say, hey, you don't support this yet, why not? So here we go. This is the Chromium bug for subgrid. And I've very handily just put a little QR code there. Now, if you go to that bug, you can create a quick account with your Gmail account and star the bug. And that says, I am a web developer who is interested in subgrid. I would like you to implement it. You don't need to go and add comments and so on. That just adds noise for engineers. But if you go and just star it, you're saying, hey, I would like to have this. I'm someone who is interested in this feature. Do that for any feature, in any browser. Firefox have got their tracker. Do that for any feature in any browser that you're interested in. Go and star it. Go and like it. The other nice thing about doing that as well is when there's any activity on that bug, you'll get a message so you can kind of see what's going on. It gives you a bit of an insight into what's happening in the web platform. That's quite fun anyway. Write about the stuff you want to see on your blog, tweet about it, write it on Medium, whatever. Actually talk about the things that you want to see and the use cases you've got. At the CSS Working Group, we're often looking to see what authors, which is what we call web developers in CSS development land, what are you actually wanting to do? Because actually we want to design CSS that you need, not design CSS because it seems like it might be fun. We've got lots of things that we could be working on. So we want to know what you want, and one way to do that is to write up your use cases. Say, hey, I've been using Grid, and you can't do this yet. I'd like to be able to do this. We'd really like to see that. Sometimes we get features that just show up in one browser. For instance, subgrid is going to land in Firefox first because they've already done all the work, so it's likely that it will be out in a shipping implementation of Firefox fairly soon, and then we're going to all say, well, we can't use it yet. It's only in Firefox, can't use it. If you can use things, even just on your personal site, or if you can use it with a fallback, even just for something trivial, just making your captions line up more neatly, you can use this stuff with feature queries. The thing is, browsers are looking to see what we're using out there on the web. They have this information. They know what it is that we're using on our sites. Now, if browser A has supported a feature that a lot of people are excited about and a lot of people are starting to use, browser B does not want to look worse than browser A. So they're going to say, well, hang on, maybe we need to prioritize this because we've got a load of people using this property, or using this value, or using this feature, and we don't support it yet. So actually using the stuff sends a message to the browsers that, hey, this is something that we want. So this is this screenshot's for Grid Template Rows on Chrome status. You can see people starting to use it and it takes off. It's great fun poking around Chrome status and seeing what it is that people actually use out there on the web. And the other thing is to actually, when things are behind a browser flag or in like a nightly version of browsers, try them out. It's your chance to beta test the web platform. That is when you get a chance to try stuff out and offer feedback. You can offer feedback to the browser if you find a bug. If you've read the spec and you know that what that browser is doing just isn't right, or you're trying it with some other part of CSS, you're playing around with subgrid and writing modes and it doesn't work properly. You could raise that actually against the browser. You can raise a bug there. Or if you find something that actually we haven't put in the spec as a CSS Working Group, we would love for you to come and give us your feedback. All of our issues are on GitHub. So just like any open source project, you can come along and you can offer your feedback to CSS. If you spot something, if you have a use case that we haven't solved yet, let us know about it. We really would like to know. So there's sort of all our issues there. CSS takes a long time to develop, and it may well be that you leave an issue there and you think nobody has taken any notice of this. And then in 6 months' time, it'll get picked up because there's actually a very few people who work on layout specs, as it turns out, and they're all really busy. And they tend to be busy, depending on what is being implemented in browsers. There'll be lots of issues coming from browser vendors. I'm the editor for multi-column layout. At the moment, Firefox are doing a bunch of work on multi-column layout, so I get a lot of issues about multi-column layout because they're working on it. Whereas if they weren't working on it, there'd be nothing coming in. So the people who work on CSS tend to be very busy, and it might take a while before the thing you've raised an issue for becomes the thing that we discuss. But we do discuss all of this stuff. And so when, subgrid is going into grid level 2, which will probably go to CR fairly soon. So then we'll work on grid level 3, and who knows what features will go into grid level 3. It may be something that you post saying, I want to be able to do this. And we'll say, well, hang on, that's something that we could put into level 3. We'll be looking for those features. So we do take those seriously. I know that the discussion from the working group can seem incredibly academic and sometimes quite angry. We actually all like each other quite a lot. It just doesn't sound like that. But we do care very much about the feedback that we get. And I'm always very happy to help people raise an issue if you're a little bit nervous about entering that world. You can always ping me first, and I will be smiley around it. Because I'd really like to get more web developers involved in this stuff. There's lots of ways, I say, to participate in the web platform. It could just be writing about this stuff. It might just be using it. It might just be, going and starring a bug on a browser and saying, hey, please, can you implement this? Very few people actually do get involved, which means that the voices of those who do are hugely amplified. You've got an awful lot of influence if you become someone who gets involved in this stuff. Don't hope that people like me will speak for you. I'm a web developer. I still build websites, and I try to be a good voice for other web developers. But I don't do everything. I'm not a React developer, for example, so I don't know what that world is interested in. So please, whichever part of this world you're in, offering your feedback makes it better for all of us. And I would say that although an awful lot of the work I've done for the web platform has been basically as a sort of unpaid advocate for the platform, I couldn't have learned anything that I have learned from any college course or book. Being able to talk to browser engineers and have things explained to me about how browsers work. I've been able to learn how to write specifications. The web platform has given me an awful lot back in return for my contributing to it. And if you are interested in this stuff, if you're interested in CSS, it's a very, very good way to participate, to make the web better for your future self, and also to learn a lot of really cool and interesting things. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that was useful in some way. And yeah, look forward to subgrid. We're getting it soon.